Greg Oliver speaking.
Greg Oliver, it's Mike Richards calling from rawmikeRichards.com. Thanks for joining us here this morning.
Hey, my pleasure, Mike.
You know, it is just so interesting. Dave and I talking this morning, we just showed when Ravishing Rick Rude goes on Regis and Kelly. We just had a moment with the Macho Man on Arsenio. And when you look back at that time, the book is called The First 25 Years, Raw 25. Boy, the personalities were rock star big, and you didn't have to be a wrestling aficionado or even a fan to understand who some of those names were. It really was a time of, I think, tremendous creativity, aside from a business prowess that just really steamrolled an entire, and maybe even invented an entire genre.
Well, yes and no. I mean, some of that was before that time with the Hulk Hogan's and even the Randy Savage. I mean, he was on Raw, yeah, but that was the later days of his career. I mean, the heyday of the Hogan making mainstream and Wrestling Matter was a little bit earlier than that. But Monday Night Raw and the explosion of cable television, and it wasn't just them. I mean, we had Monday Night Nitro that with WCW that really helped them up their game. So there was just so much TV and not the 500 channels that we have now. So wrestling really mattered at that point, and it had amazing ratings when you look back on it.
Yeah, it really was, Greg. And thanks for joining us this morning. A lot of people that, some people probably know this, but for anybody that doesn't, there was a good portion of a decade that Monday Night Raw and also WCW Nitro outdrew Monday Night Football. And that was unheard of at that time, considering Monday Night Football was a staple for the last 50 years or so. When everything came together in the 90s and you had a chance to research this, what was the thinking of having a weekly wrestling show, something that was very, pay-per-view light-ish, where every single week they'd put together 2 hours, if not 3 hours of wrestling? What was the brainchild of it? It was obviously Vince McMahon, but was there a thought that, maybe they have a 5-year run, maybe they have a 2-year run, 25 years for a continuing show, summer, winter, fall, spring? That's unheard of. There's no other television show like it in the history of television.
Well, I mean, he wasn't exactly breaking new ground. I mean, wrestling in the 50s was one of the first things on the DuMont network nationally. So, I mean, wrestling hadn't been on nationally in prime time for a long time. So that's really the difference here is that, every wrestling promotion had their shows. WWE had their shows, WWF as it was called back then. But yeah, the idea to put it on mainstream, on cable in prime time. And as you alluded to there, the most important part was they began putting on competitive matches. So much of pro wrestling up to that time had been what we call squash matches, where they were the big tough guys would decimate some poor hapless jobber. And it was entertaining to a point, but you really were drawn, or you were basically told to go to the arena to see the real competition. All of a sudden on television with Monday Night Raw, they started giving away some marquee matches that made you want to stay home and see it. It changed the business model for sure. Television became a lot more important, the ratings, and it was less about the going to the arena. But it was a national scale, and it drew and it continues to draw today. It's not what it was in the heyday of the 90s anymore, but then no show on television is, right? Just like we'll never see another rating like the finale of MASH got. I mean, TV has changed and splintered.
Yeah, it certainly has. Is there a favorite wrestler you like out of that Attitude Era of the 90s that we speak of, or is there, if we were to say, the ultimate, and with all due respect to the Ultimate Warrior, but the ultimate wrestler of the Raw package, the 25 years, is which guy in your opinion?
Well, it's Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. I don't think you can separate the two. But the way The Rock has permeated our culture as a huge, movie star and the most bankable guy in Hollywood, every day we see him as a reminder of what he meant to the growth of pro wrestling with WWE. And that's a credit to him. He's an incredibly hardworking guy. I think I did his first ever wrestling interview. He was just a young kid standing in the back at Skydome when they introduced Tiger Ali Singh, the son of Tiger Jeet Singh.
Yep.
And so Rocky was an afterthought at that thing, but I introduced myself, and we had people in common, including his his uncle Ricky, who lived in Toronto. So I knew these guys, and I knew how to get a story out of them, and I did. And since then, I've basically met his entire family.
Well, and it's interesting to use the word family because, the time I spent out in Calgary, I got to know Bret Hart pretty well, and that whole association with the Hart family, the Hart Foundation, just all those people that all of a sudden become more or less family. And I guess, looking at from your perspective, is that what you found sort of on the journalistic side of things, that even when you first started, that one leads into another, which leads into another, and all of a sudden it is this network of like a pseudo family when you start talking about the world of wrestling?
There is an element of that for sure too. However, they're not held together. Like the older wrestlers are not held together the way that, let's say, old hockey players are. There's no alumni association. There's no pension plan. So there's nobody keeping track of where everybody is. The closest thing they have is called the Alumni Club. And WWE is a supporter of it, but they're not certainly backing it financially or anything like that. And that's essentially the Alumni Club, a very loose affiliation of pro wrestling across the nation. So without that backbone, these guys do have trouble losing touch with each other. However, when you see them get together at conventions or fan fests or whatever, the magic is there. These guys can pick up like they hadn't seen each other in 20 years, but they can pick up in those conversations and laugh about the ridiculous hijinks, whether it was in the dressing room or driving from town to town or whatever other fun they got up to, some of it very adult. They tell great stories.
We talked about the 90s and the popularity of it and how it probably will never get to that stage, but are we seeing a revitalization of wrestling today in 2018? Because it seems to me almost, and not even at the WWE level, but it seems to be regaining popularity, I guess we can say, is maybe the best way of saying it.
The best way to explain it is there's more eyes on pro wrestling than ever before. Now, they're not all watching the same product, which is a big difference from the heyday of WCW, WWE, and then ECW. All had three competing brands that everybody seemed to be watching at the same time at the late 90s and early 2000s. So then today we have a splintering. If you like strong style and guys really beating each other up, you can now subscribe to New Japan Pro Wrestling's streaming service. If you like the ridiculous violence and stuff like that, there's garbage wrestling you can watch. If you like the really competitive stuff, there's other shows. There's women's wrestling promotions. There's this, there's that. There's so much you can watch, and it's all available at your fingertips on the computer. You can stream it. You can take it on your phone. So wrestling is in a real golden age at the moment. Where it goes from here, I'm not exactly sure. You'd think at some point they reach a saturation point.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say a golden age because when you start to own, as you said, back in the 90s. I mean, if you were a show on ABC, it was a national show. If you were, you had these massive Nielsen numbers. And of course, as things, I guess, get more or less diluted, then I guess, once you start talking about the advent of the internet and the availability of watching some of these events is what they are. Do you think that then there's credit, I think, also to the organization itself to not lose out on that, to try to keep control of what you've got? Because as you said, all of a sudden you've gone from just maybe even a pay-per-view event or what you see on a weekly basis to all of a sudden, as long as you got a laptop, you can watch some material. Well,
the question always comes down to monetizing it. Right? So, if it's available on YouTube, you're making your fractions of a penny when somebody watches it. If it's on a pay-per-view, like Impact Wrestling's running a pay-per-view here on July 22nd down at Rebel Entertainment Complex in Toronto, a pay-per-view at this day and age means that you actually have to, contact your cable company or register online to actually watch something. It seems like it's technology from, 3 decades ago when it really isn't. It's like it's a big stretch. Whereas WWE with their WWE network that people pay, I think it's $11.99 or $12.99 here in Canada a month, you're getting all those shows, what we call pay-per-views. You get them included in your package. It's a different business model than it used to be. Wrestling is still progressing and changing. In some ways, they've led the way. WWE Network is a great example of how to take your content that you already have and continue to monetize it. They've been buying up all these tape archives, this and that, and it's really the only place to watch some of these old matches anymore is their network. So if you want to watch Harley Race beat Terry Funk, that's the best place to go, unless you can find it, through a tape trader, which still exists, right? Some people still exchange, DVDs or have them. Or there's, maybe it's on YouTube and it'll be there for, 3 weeks before somebody at WWE notices it and has it taken down.
Greg, what are you working on now lately? I know you have 10 books and counting. What's the end counting part? What can we expect? And can you tell us a little bit more about the project?
My co-writing partner, Steve Johnson, and I have done, there's 4 books in the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame series. We did Canadians. I did that one. And then we did tag teams, and we did heels, and we did heroes and icons. And what Steve and I found is we had so much stuff left over that we said, what are we going to do? So let's do storytellers. So the idea is that you'd collect up all the other things, about Tuffy Truesdale wrestling alligators and the midgets and the guys who used to wrestle in a big ring full of smelts. I mean, there's so many unique stories that need to be told. And so we're almost done that. It should be submitted to ECW Press by the end of the month, and then should be out next fall. But to be honest, I'm looking for a little change. And so after that's done, I'm diving into a biography on the great late actor Billy Van, who we know from House of Frightenstein,
sure,
who we know from Party Game. I've already done some work on it, but I really need to dive back in there. I need to get that Cher interview done.
I think you're very busy, but I didn't get past wrestling in smelts.
Yeah, well, there's so much about pro wrestling that's been forgotten, and it's such an amazing part of culture, not just in North America, but I mean, Mexican and lucha is so unique. You got the Japanese, and now what we're seeing is a real world expansion with wrestling. I mean, these guys don't have to be in WWE, and they can make a living traveling the world as independent contractors. They have to be really good at promoting themselves and have their Twitter presence and have their Facebook presence and have their YouTube channel. But these guys can make a living not being on the big show, which is pretty amazing. Yeah,
well, it's a history very unlike others, and certainly longer than others. I grew up in Stouffville, Ontario, so occasionally, the traveling shows would get there. And Haystacks Calhoun actually was in town. That was like a pretty big deal. People asking him, I don't know how many times, how much he eats. But then they had what they quote-unquote midget wrestling. And I was horrified. I don't know, maybe it's a thing that I didn't realize. And then women came on that weren't young women, by the way. It wasn't necessarily the diva-looking women that were fighting in Stouffville, Ontario, at the hockey rink, but the fascination was there. And to me, looking back as a kid at this thing, never would I have thought that it would have been, a multi-billion-dollar international industry that has been built. It is amazing how, that structure from, as you said, back in the 50s where I think wrestling probably also was a term, that it's come all the way to this. It really is a fascinating business study, I think.
But it's not just a business study, it's a cultural study, too. I mean, women weren't allowed to wrestle in Ontario. They were allowed to put on exhibitions. So it wasn't until that changed in I think it was the later 70s, that they were actually allowed to start wrestling. So, I mean, there's a cultural change. I mean, the way women get pushed today in WWE, they're top of the card. They can main event. That's changed. I mean, we don't call them midget wrestling anymore. It's little people. And yet there's the midget warriors. They go out there and proudly call themselves that. And they tour from bar to bar and put on neat shows that are unique. And they've managed to carve out a little niche of the market themselves. So, there's definitely things that have changed through the years. And the way they monetize and the way they can present it is certainly changed too. And wrestling's an amazing business. It's not an easy business for sure.
Greg, thanks so much for taking the time to join us this morning. The book looks fantastic. We're going to give one away here shortly. I know a lot of wrestling fans. This is, as I said, in time for Father's Day. It's a great gift. So thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. It was a lot of fun here today.
Cool. Well, people can read more on Slam Wrestling, of course, part of the Post Media's Canoe website.
Absolutely. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That is Greg Oliver. He is the author of 10 books. And once again, Slam Wrestling, that's where he did the review of this particular book.
Yeah.
What? Did we just become best friends? Yep.